and welcome to this week's episode of Wide Angle. The Republic Day chief guests in India this year are leaders of all 10 ASEAN countries. It's the 25th year of the India-ASEAN Strategic Partnership. Joining us to talk about what ASEAN means for India, what it means for the region, what it means for global peace and stability and economic cooperation is the former Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, who's just written, co-authored a book called The ASEAN Miracle. Thank you very much, sir, for being on Wide Angle. I want to start by asking you, your book is very timely, of course, given that it's coming as the leaders arrive in India, but it's also a very optimistic picture of what ASEAN can be going forward at a time when there are tensions in two major countries in the region, India and China, with each other.
Well, I mean, the ASEAN is a miracle because it has weathered even bigger storms than what you see between China and India today. In fact, ASEAN was an organization that should have failed on many counts. You know, when it was founded in 1967, the biggest wars in the world were being fought in Southeast Asia. More bombs were dropped on Indochina than in all of Europe in World War II. And so we've experienced far greater conflict and far greater tensions. And the remarkable thing about ASEAN, it has that survived and outlived and succeeded despite these many challenges, and therefore it's a real miracle.
But also, you talk about how this region is very diverse,
yes,
in terms of culture, religion, language, national identity, etc., and yet have been able to come together for this grouping. Nonetheless, you do point to certain weaknesses within ASEAN. So what do you think, in spite of the strengths of the grouping, what do you think are its major weaknesses?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you raised the point of diversity, because one of the important facts about ASEAN that almost nobody knows is that ASEAN is the most diverse region on planet Earth. You know, out of 600 million people, you have 240 million Muslims, 110 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, and then you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and Communists. So it's an amazingly diverse region, and that's why its success actually brings a lot of hope in a world where we are so frightened of a clash of civilizations. But when you mention the weaknesses of ASEAN, the real paradox of ASEAN is that its strength lies in its weakness. Because it's perceived to be not a strong superpower of its own, but actually a relatively weak organization, it is trusted by all the great powers, and therefore the only organization that provides a geopolitical platform for all the great powers to meet every year. You know, US, China, Japan, India, Russia, EU, Australia, New Zealand, Korea. Why do they come to this ASEAN meetings? Because everybody trusts ASEAN. So sometimes the weaknesses of ASEAN is the strength of the organization.
But you also talk about how the grouping itself has no strong institutions. That's one of the things you point out. And I think more interestingly for someone like me who's looking at the issues of identity, you make the comparison with the European Union, where you say that for many European Union member citizens, they identify themselves as citizens of the Union as well as their own individual national identities. ASEAN doesn't have that. So if I, as a citizen of an ASEAN member state, for example, don't identify myself as ASEAN, don't relate to that identity, is that a weakness?
Yes, in fact, I can see you've read the book very well. When I compare the ASEAN to the European Union, certainly the European Union is ahead in some ways, and certainly the man in the street in Europe identifies more with the European project than the man in the street in ASEAN does, which is why one of the biggest accomplishments of this book that I've just written, The ASEAN Miracle, I think is that it is the first book that is going to be translated into all ASEAN languages. So it will be accessible to the man in the street also. But we have to go do more than that. In fact, one of the concrete recommendations of the book is that if you compare the European Union to ASEAN, The economy, the total GNP of the European Union is 6 times that of ASEAN, much bigger obviously. But the budget of the European Secretariat is 8,000 times larger than ASEAN. So clearly, I think one way to remedy this lack of ownership of ASEAN by the ASEAN people is to actually strengthen the ASEAN Secretariat and get it to do a better job of educating the populations within ASEAN about what a miracle ASEAN is. And that's why, as you know, I've recommended in the book that ASEAN should receive the Nobel Peace Prize, because I think once ASEAN receives the Nobel Peace Prize, the people in ASEAN wake up and say, wow, my organization, members, right? we are ASEAN members and we've received the Nobel Peace Prize.
Coming back to the geostrategics of the region, you start off by saying that in its inception, ASEAN was fundamentally a pro-US grouping 50 years ago. The world has changed. We're seeing, whether you want to call it multipolarity or unipolarity, but it's certainly not the United States, which is now the most active player in this region, even though they have a strong military presence. When Donald Trump came to power and the United States has decided to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, there has been concern amongst ASEAN member countries as well of kind of being left to their own devices when it comes to dealing with China. There's been an argument for India to kind of step up or step into the role and the vacuum created by America's exit. Do you see that as something that's workable in a strategic way?
Well, I think for a start, I would say that let's be clear in our assessment of what Donald Trump has done in his 1 year in his office. I would say his bark is worse than his bite. And if you look at all his campaign promises, I'll declare China currency manipulator on the first day in the office, I'll get Japan and South Korea to pay for their defense and so on and so forth. He's made all kinds of statements, but actually there has been far greater continuity in American policy. And I would say America's commitment to engagement with Southeast Asia has not gone down at all under Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump in his first year in office has visited more Asian countries than any other American president in his first year in office. And he was there in Manila, as you know, for the East Asian Summit, where amazingly at the opening ceremony in Philippines, a Catholic country, he saw a performance of the Ramayana taking place in front of him. So America has not left, and I don't think America will leave the region. But nonetheless, despite that, whether America stays or America goes, it's very clear that the ASEAN countries want to have a deeper engagement with India. And this is for reasons, not just for contemporary geopolitical reasons, but it's because the relationship between Southeast Asia and India goes back several thousand years. And most Indians are not aware that out of the 10 ASEAN countries, 9 of them, only exception being Vietnam, have cultural foundations which are Indian in origin. And everywhere you go in Southeast Asia, you'll see shadow play of Ramayana, Mahabharata. And in 1987, just 30 years ago, when the leader of the world's most populous Islamic country, Indonesia, wanted to erect a monument in the center of the city to commemorate a celebration, he erected a monument of Arjuna from the Mahabharata. So one of the biggest monuments in the world's biggest Islamic country is dedicated to Arjuna from the Mahabharata. So that's an indication of how deep and ancient the links are between India and Southeast Asia. They were cut off by 200 years of colonial rule. They were cut off during the Cold War, but they can be restored again. So the current geopolitical ups and downs are not the fundamental reason why ASEAN countries want to see greater engagement with India. They see it as much more of a natural relationship which should be strengthened for the next 1,000 years.
You're right, the Arjuna Vijaya statue in Jakarta is, I think, a point to the cultural linkages, and as you point out, there are many cultural similarities, even if not linguistic, but religious and cultural similarities across the region, including with India. One of the reasons perhaps why India sort of focused on its Look East policy all those years ago as a major foreign policy initiative, and therefore the partnership with ASEAN. India is now also seeing itself perhaps part of the Look East policy, but also it's looking west as it traditionally has done, and at the western edge of the Eastern world, perhaps. So the quadrilateral, for example, that the Americans have been talking about, the India, Australia, Japan, United States partnership of the Quad. How does that play out in this larger geostrategic space?
Yeah, just a quick point, the linguistic point. Actually, Sanskrit is deeply embedded in Southeast Asia. Singapore comes from two Sanskrit words, Singa and Pura, lion city. So it's there
as the root language. Yes.
But your point about the Quad, I think it is too early to make a judgment on how resilient the Quad is. It is basically a marriage of convenience. It is not a marriage of love, I guess. Among four countries, and everyone knows, this is not a big secret, that it is driven by a common concern about China.
Right.
Clearly, one concern that United States, Japan, Australia and India have is a concern about a rising China and how you manage it, and so on and so forth. So the Quad could be one way of managing it, but I think the better idea is the one that actually President Trump has proposed of an Indo-Pacific community. And an Indo-Pacific community is much more inclusive. It includes more countries, and it also, by the way, includes China. So the best way of managing the rise of China is to try and integrate China into the regional fabric, so that there'll be less incentives for China, or there'll be constraints on China to become more aggressive as it emerges. So that's why I think when President Trump proposed the Indo-Pacific community, I thought that was a much better idea. And that's an idea that I think will be a better way actually of integrating India into East Asia, into the Pacific region.
And yet, that may be true that it's a marriage of convenience, but there is also this issue, as you pointed out, it's about concerns vis-a-vis China. India's concerns about China's expansionism via the Maritime Silk Route, the Belt and Road Initiative, what's going on our eastern borders as well, whether it's the military standoffs. There are serious concerns, there are serious tensions, and so India is going to find itself in a complicated situation. You're saying that ASEAN countries don't want to be caught in this choose India, choose China, choose America kind of situation, because the relationship with all three is equally important. But national interest doesn't play out that way often. It's kind of utopian to say that also.
I think all of us, all the neighbors of China have to learn to manage a rising China. Okay, clearly a China that becomes the #1 economy in the world, and in PPP terms, China is already the #1 economy in the world. In nominal terms, within a decade, it'll be the #1 economy in the world. So you've got to learn to manage rising power. And so the question is, how do you do it? And I think in the case of China and India, actually, if you look at it objectively, it's quite remarkable how stable the relationship has been despite the ups and downs. And the border has been very, very peaceful for decades now. So the question is, how do we keep it even more peaceful?
Even the issues with China, but you're saying the US, whether they've said things they've said, the policies kind of have a continuity to them. I think India also often finds itself possibly in the same situation that many ASEAN countries do vis-a-vis India and China. India finds itself in that position vis-a-vis the United States as well, of having to choose and yet not wanting to, balancing out its own national interest. Nonetheless, coming back to the strengths and weaknesses of ASEAN, when you talk about identity as a union, no strong institutions, do you think India, even as a dialogue partner, strategic partner for ASEAN, can step in? And would ASEAN countries want to see a greater full partnership, full membership?
Yeah, I think certainly there's no doubt that the ASEAN countries would like to see a bigger role being played by India in the geopolitical sphere. The question is, how does India, how do you say, maximize its leverage in this game? And I've actually written an article about this, saying that if you can imagine a seesaw with United States on one end and China on the other end, and that's the big game is going to be between United States and China. And both sides are playing a very clever game. I mean, if you on the surface, if you watched Donald Trump, how warm he was towards President Xi Jinping and all that, I mean, it's a very clever game that they're playing. The question is, where does India position itself in the seesaw? And the best place to be is to stand in the middle. So whichever foot you put in, you affect the balance. And in fact, Henry Kissinger, in his book on China, pointed out that the way the United States defeated the Soviet Union was to get China to join its side against the Soviet Union, right? So the United States positioned itself in the middle, very cleverly, right? And so that's the best position for India to be in this seesaw relationship between US and China, because that will maximize your leverage. And the more leverage that India has globally, the better it is for ASEAN. So because it is good for the Southeast Asian region to have many powers present in the region, to have China there, to have United States there, to have Japan there, to have India there. So that's good for the region. So you'll find that when Indians come to Southeast Asia and knock on the doors are open for for Indians to come back into Southeast Asia.
In fact, at the beginning of your book, you refer to something called the Indian wave or the
That's
India
right.
wave.
Yeah.
So is this a sort of second Indian wave that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think what it's important to ask ourselves, what is normal in the relationship between India and Southeast Asia, and what is abnormal. So what we have now, the gap and the distance between India and Southeast Asia, that's abnormal. It's only 200 years. But if you look at the previous 1800 years, for example, India and Southeast Asia were blended together almost like one community, and that's why there's no other part of the world, whether Central Asia or Middle East or Africa, where you have as much Indian influence on cultures as you have in Southeast Asia. So it's abnormal to have this gap and distance between India and ASEAN. So that's why when the ASEAN leaders come here, what you should celebrate is not just a momentary event, but you should celebrate the re-establishment of a close relationship that goes back 2,000 years. That's the significance of this ASEAN-India meeting.
One of the things that's sort of a top priority as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned, or strategic thought is concerned, is the fight against terrorism. It's with specific reference, of course, to Pakistan and cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, but the general arc of Islamic terror that most countries in the world are engaged in countering right now. That arc spreads to some ASEAN countries as well. Your own country, Singapore, has an extensive counter-terrorism strategy that it's evolved. Is that an area of partnership? Because again, as you pointed out, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, outside the Middle East, the volatile Middle East. India is the second largest Muslim nation in the world. And yet we have this predominance of focus on counter-terrorism, focused on Islamic terrorism. How does that play out in ASEAN?
Oh, I think the good news here is that there is a complete unanimity of views that we have to work together to counter terrorism. And by the way, I think Indonesia has suffered as many attacks as other countries have, as India has.
Right, absolutely.
And they've had bombs going off at the entrances to hotels. So today, if you go to Indonesia, just as you come to hotels in India, your car has to be checked. In Indonesia, your car has to be checked too. So again, in the battle against terrorism, you find a complete unanimity of views. And actually, the good news is that we are in this region succeeding in the battle.
Okay.
And there is actually one of the side effects of the 9/11 episode is that intelligence cooperation globally against terrorism has gone up significantly, and the United States actually has played a very important role in trying to coordinate global intelligence against terrorism. And as you know, ASEAN countries do work with the United States on counter-terrorism efforts. So I'm sure they'd be happy to work with India also on counter-terrorism efforts.
You just made the case about how there's been success stories as well in counter-terrorism. You're right, the Bali bombings were in fact an inflection point in how Southeast Asia looked at Islamic terrorism as well. You're saying that they could work together on counter-terror strategies, but I think also, what about how ASEAN countries and partners like India work in terms of creating or changing the discourse on counter-terror globally, not just for the region itself?
Yeah, I think I would say in the case of counter-terrorism, there's actually quite a strong global consensus that we have to work together to solve the problem, because terrorism attacks, as you know, happen everywhere. They've happened in Africa, they've happened in Europe, they've happened 9/11 in America, and I was there when 9/11 happened in New York. It happened in Bali, you mentioned. Happen in Australia. So it's not a problem that's confined to one region.
But I think the question is, in developing counter strategies, could ASEAN, because of its own internal successes, in partnership with countries like India, which has a strong counter-terror strategy domestically as well, could they lead the narrative globally in counter-terrorism? Because right now it's seen as a very Western-led kind of strategy, Western-led focus.
I would say that the counter-terrorism battle is best fought quietly and behind the scenes with strong intelligence cooperation. That's far more critical than anything else, because I mean, it's not a case of trying to develop a consensus against terrorism, because no country stands up and says, I'm in favor of terrorism. So the important thing is to make sure you develop the networks and close trust among intelligence agencies. And I think that's happening, you know. My sense is that it is happening. And so I think that's one dimension. But at the same time, I think if you really want to build a relationship of trust between ASEAN and India, it's got to be a multi-dimensional relationship. You can't just focus. So the economic part is very, very critical. And as you know, India has some hesitations about opening up its economy and so on and so forth. So those sorts of issues are far more important in terms of bringing India and ASEAN closer together.
In fact, that brings me to my final question. You talked about, you know, how there have been issues on the trade front as well. Globally, we're seeing a move towards protectionism across economies, whether it's in the European Union, whether it is from the US. Again, Trump's policy announcements on protectionism against free trade, things like that. How do ASEAN countries negotiate that within themselves, and how will they work on negotiations with India to increase free trade, to work on the economic zones and free trade areas?
Well, I think the good news here is another example where Trump's words are worse than his deeds. And actually, in terms of protectionism, he has not so far, touch wood, taken any actions that you can say are outrightly protectionist, apart from the fact, of course, that he walked away from TPP, but he's walked away from an agreement that hadn't been signed yet. So that's a different matter. But the ASEAN countries, by and large, believe in trade. In fact, the reason why ASEAN has succeeded so well is because ASEAN's trade with the rest of the world is phenomenal, you know. And it's growing very fast. And fortunately, as you know, last year and this year, probably 2018, global trade is still growing. And the ASEAN countries have found that the best way to raise their economies is to have greater trade flows. So you find that, for example, Singapore is chairman of ASEAN this year in 2018. And one of the priorities that Singapore has set for itself is to try and complete the RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, which brings together the 10 ASEAN countries and Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand and India. And I think it's not as, it's sort of well known that India is the most reluctant in some ways. So this is an area where I think it's good for India to do some long-term calculations and find out if it really wants to be part of the Indo-Pacific community. And I think the Indo-Pacific community is a great idea that Trump has launched. Then you've got to, the best way to integrate yourself in the Indo-Pacific community is through trade flows. Right. And that should be the priority. It's difficult at first, and we, ASEAN countries of course, we ourselves found it difficult initially to open up our borders to each other. I mean, Indonesia was afraid, like Indonesia used to be afraid, my God, if we open our biggest market, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore will take advantage of it. And at the end of the day, they found that they've also grown. Indonesia has outperformed basically every middle power in the last 20-30 years. If you look at my book, there are charts and statistics that show how Indonesia has outperformed Nigeria, outperformed Brazil. Everyone talks of the Brazilian miracle. Indonesia has done better. Right? And why? Because Indonesia took the brave decision to open up its markets to ASEAN. And Indonesia also joined the China-ASEAN Free Trade Area Agreement. So, you know, it can be done. It's a question of, you got to, of course, you know, it's one of the fundamental aspects of free markets is that you will have creative destruction, right? You can't stop creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter has told us that, the economist. So if you open up your economy, some sectors will become uncompetitive, but you'll discover new competitive sectors. You don't know where they'll be, but they'll happen, you know. That's part of the process of how free markets work. And we must, when you allow the free markets to work, then your economy grows. And ASEAN is living proof of that, because no other region can match ASEAN's record in economic growth. And ASEAN is really the 7th largest economy in the world, and on its way to becoming the 4th largest economy in the world.
As a group?
As a group, yes. And that's amazing.
So free trade agreement, implementation of a free trade agreement perhaps is the way
forward. Free trade agreements are a very critical part of the ASEAN success story.
As we said, that the leaders are coming for Republic Day, all 10 of them as chief guests, and I think that itself is a significant symbol of where India is looking for its strategic and economic growth as well. But perhaps these conversations will lead to some sort of fruition as well at those meetings. Kishore Mahbubani, thanks very much for joining us on Wide Angle. Thank you.